welcome Norman Sherman to it's a great honor for the Keen on Yoga podcast to have you here today. Norman was really one of the forerunners, I think, with Elizabeth D. Michaelis' book for modern yoga scholarship. And he published a book, very influential book called The Traditions of the Mysore Palace. Is that right?
The yoga tradition of the Mysore Palace.
Yoga traditions of the Mysore Palace. And that was, I think, was it 97? I've got that date in my mind. Or it was something.
I think 96.
Yeah, bloody early, whatever. And before anyone else was really talking it, but previous to that was translations of Sanskrit texts, and there was no modern scholarship, and Norman really kicked that off. So, we're really honoured to have Norman here today. Just give me a basic overview, Norman, as you were mentioning before we started, of what inspired you in the first place to get involved in yoga scholarship, as it were. You really have been a pioneer in the field.
Well, I didn't really start with the yoga scholarship. As I was saying, it was Sanskrit that started it off. And I was walking down the street in Odengarten one day and heard the word Sanskrit. And somehow I knew that I was going to study Sanskrit. And I didn't even know it was an Indian language. So I did start. And I had a terrible time in Sweden studying because people study academically, and I like to be able to speak. And at the same time that I started studying Sanskrit, I started working with a book by Ghosh in Sweden, trying to learn yoga from a book. I was always interested in yoga because I didn't like team sports, like those kind of things. And yoga was a possibility of doing things. And then actually a French fellow came to Stockholm and he taught 10 lessons in yoga, and he had been in a car accident and had been damaged badly. And he had a Chinese physiotherapist who noticed that some of the things he was doing were like yoga, and got him doing yoga, and he ended up being able to clear his whole body except for cut tendons. So that was my start. And as far as the yoga tradition of the Mysore Palace, the question that came up there was, where do all these asanas come from? Because they aren't in the original text. And that was my prime motivating factor. And then I found the Sritattvanidhi text, and the Oriental Institute in Mysore wouldn't let me photograph it or use it. They had a copy. There was 3 hand-done copies made of it, but His Highness allowed me to photograph the Sritattvanidhi in the palace. So that's how I managed to get a hold of that text and work on that text, which was then, of course, that was the only source of asanas at the time.
Yeah. I mean, no, it's very. People probably don't know that how unique it was that Norman got to photograph that text, because subsequently everyone, Jason Birch and Jim Mallison and other people, modern scholars that we might know, have been using these photographs of yours with your permission, I believe, because no one else can get to see it now. I just want to back up a second, because how did you what were you doing in Sweden? And were you already studying yoga at the time? You said you mentioned Sanskrit. You're Canadian as a background, in terms of your upbringing. You're Canadian. So, and what was happening up to that point that got you into yoga, and what other scholarship had you done previously?
I started in. I took a BA at the University of British Columbia, and I entered into a field cand in Stockholm's University, and that's been an interesting thing for me, because, for example, in studies like literature in North America, they would say, read that book and tell me what it's about, and don't tell me what the critics are saying. But in Sweden, you have a compendium. You may read a paragraph of the work, and you have a compendium telling you everything about the author, his mother, his father, his psychological problems, and and what the interpretations are. And then, of course, going to India, I spent almost 25 years in India, and I was working with mostly with traditional pandits, and I was ostracized in the university for working with pandits because that wasn't modern learning. But that was just a period of a different kind of learning altogether. And there, instead of knowledge being sort of an accumulation of information in some kind of way, knowledge is worked as transformative. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work in the same way. Like if you say you know something, you'll get tested on it.
So you were living in India for 25 years, or back and forth. I don't know exactly your background. Were you an academic in Stockholm, or and what were you studying? What were you translating before this seminal book that we all know?
I began studying world literature and Scandinavian literature,
right?
And that included Icelandic, Danish, and Norwegian literature as well. And then I switched to Sanskrit and religious studies. And then in India, I was at the Center of Advanced Studies in Sanskrit for 6 years doing a PhD. And then I went to Mysore, and I studied with pandits for another 20 years. And the kind of studying that I used to do, I'd spend about 2 hours in the morning working with somebody individually. And then I'd have to try and remember that in the afternoon, and then spend another hour in the evening with a teacher. I wouldn't talk past 6 o'clock at night because it was too difficult to remember things if you talk too much. And so I studied shastras there, where it got to the point where anything that I wanted to study, it was like a 5-year job of 2 hours a day. And finally, you have to put a limit on what you can study. And even after all of that study, I actually took a pandit degree in the Mahapathasala. And even after all that study, you still feel like you're a charlatan.
Were you publishing these works? I mean, or were you just learning for your own sake?
I was just learning for my own sake, really. I never thought of publishing. Right. In fact, even the yoga tradition of the Mysore Palace was ready 5 years before it got published. I couldn't find a publisher. Nobody wanted it. They wanted a how-to book on yoga.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I didn't realize how committed you were to yoga. Is that something that you found in your upbringing? I mean, were there roots in your childhood, or what was the thing that motivated you to spend all these years studying like this?
Well, really, I felt that yoga and Sanskrit were about the same thing, about concentration.
Right.
So they work together.
Right. Fair enough. Yeah, exactly. But you were practicing postural yoga as well, weren't you? I mean,
yeah, I was doing postural yoga. I was working with I got to the point where I was working with advanced asanas with Iyengar. And even finding him, I didn't know. I had found his book in Sweden some time before, and then I went to Pune, and I was at the university, and I found out that he was teaching. So I went over to his place and asked him if he would teach me.
Really? When was that? I didn't know that.
That was in 1970, about 1970 or something.
Oh, right. Okay. So early on, that must have been incredible.
Well, there were no foreigners. There were very few foreigners that came to him at that time.
Yeah.
And I got put in with an. In fact, it was always a problem with when new foreigners came. The first thing would be breaking down. You think that you're going to get enlightened in 5 minutes or something like that, and then there would be a dressing down.
I mean, one problem was probably that you wasn't there, that you spoke the languages probably. I imagine you could, by that time, be quite communicative with BKS Iyenger and Marathi or such?
Oh, I never studied. I studied Marathi just very slightly, but Iyengar actually speaks Kannada.
Oh, does he?
And
Right.
he's in Iyengar. The Iyengars in Karnataka speak Tamil.
Oh. And did you manage to learn that?
Yeah, no, I didn't speak to him at all in Canada at that time. I didn't know enough Canada to be able to talk to him. That came much later.
What do you think of BKS? I wasn't planning to quiz you on BKS Iyengar, but what did you think of your teaching of BKS Iyengar in your time with him?
Well, at the time, there, I mean, it was a very small class, so he was teaching. Like I quit going to him when he got his new shala built by CS. But what I find is I've had to teach, for example, at the University of Calgary, I was asked to teach a 5-lecture course on Tibetan art. And it was in one of these lecture theaters where they scooped down and I realized as soon as I walked into there, you're not teaching any longer, you're performing. And what I sort of feel like with the even with yoga and all of these things is yoga is really an individual. It was Yogendra who started yoga classes, and yoga classes are sort of like a slightly less damaging issue of Zoom, where you watch people but you don't touch them. So whatever they do within the range of their own postural preferences. And unless you have that one-on-one teaching, it just doesn't really work. And I've been very fortunate because I've had one-on-one teaching in Sanskrit over a period of 20, 25 years, and also one-on-one teaching on yoga.
So you didn't keep that relationship, because I think Iyengar, I think you mentioned in the in subsequent editions of the book that Iyengar wasn't immediately happy with what you were putting forth in the book. Is that right?
Oh no, nobody was happy.
No, no one was happy. No, you're right there.
Patabi Joyce used to say, yes, it is a bad book. And Iyengar said I had insulted his family.
Yeah.
And but it kind of blew the light on the guru worship, and Westerners have contributed to that. Actually, it's interesting because Abhinavagupta says that when you're trying to pursue knowledge, it's guru tar shastra taswataha. The knowledge comes from the guru. You have to back that up with knowledge from the shastras, and ultimately you have to do it on your own. And each one of these are successively more important.
So, did you meet Patabi Joyce as well?
Actually, I met him once. Darby took me over once to
Mark
see
Darby.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know you knew Mark. Just because you were there at the same time, I suppose, right?
He was living in a place just across the street from across the fence from me, actually.
Really, Darby is my teacher, my asana teacher. That's a nice coincidence. Well, I suppose the obvious question that springs to mind is, what motivated you to pursue and write the book in the first place?
Well, the big thing was where do all the asanas come from? As far as I was concerned, yoga was asanas. That was it, and it was skill in asanas which made the big difference. So I wanted to find out what the source of this was, and it's taken me. It really, I mean, that book was only the beginning, the beginning of it. Like later on, I've gone into other texts which all deal with yoga, as I sent you the book, Yoga Sutra Chintamani, and to try and find out exactly the whole tradition, because the asanas are an abbreviation blip in there.
What do you mean by that? Can you explain further?
Well, asanas can be used as a spiritual discipline, can work as a spiritual discipline if you use it in a certain way, but that's not the primary means of what we're talking about. And that's also valid. Bhartrhari, 3rd century or 5th century, said that when you're pursuing spiritual knowledges, they always start with an illusion or delusion. And if you're lucky, you may come to some idea that is actual or real.
So going back to the Sritattvanidhi, this is a unique book you got. You managed to get your hands on in the end. I mean, were you surprised with what you found there? And were you surprised that you couldn't find the Yoga Karunta anywhere inside?
Well, for a long time, I thought the Yoga Karunta didn't exist. And actually, it's interesting because I don't know that you've read the recent article of Jason Birch on Hatha Abhyasa Paddhati.
I think I have, yeah.
But I had that in my hands too, and I only photographed part of it. And that was probably the source of the Sritattvanidhi.
Huh. Right. And for people that don't know, what exactly is this text? I mean, it's how many yoga postures are detailed in it?
Well, there's 121 asanas or more. I'm not quite sure the exact number, but the Hatha Abhyasa Paddhati was used to compile the Sritattvanidhi, it looks like.
Right. And you saw that text as well?
Yeah, I photographed that text. I gave the photographs to Jason Birch, but I only took something like 30 photographs because the Sritattvanidhi the asanas were better. Actually, the asanas in the Sritattvanidhi are absolutely beautiful. They're beautiful line drawings done, and they didn't come out that way in the yoga tradition of the Mysore Palace because of his inability to make excellent page pictures.
It's not bad. You get some idea at least.
Yeah, you get an idea, but that's all you get. You don't get to see the fine artwork.
So when you were looking there originally, you were looking for the source of Krishnamacharya's yoga. Did you feel that the Sritattvanidhi expresses is explicitly that source, or do you think there's further interpolations of Krishnamacharya using that text in part and other things as well?
I think what the Sritattvanidhi did, it gave an idea of what could be done. And then you had to, but the Sritattvanidhi was not a complete text in itself. It was an illustration. So sometimes the write-up doesn't compare with the pictures, or the pictures don't compare with the particular verse. It was done by the palace ateliers.
Yeah.
So they had to kind of swing it to make it look good.
Yeah. And I mean, we surprised at what you found there, or were you expecting something of that like? I mean, what led you to find it in the first place? How did you come upon it?
Well, actually, somebody directed me to it in the Oriental Institute, and they had a copy. They had a copy, but their copy wasn't a finished copy of the Sritattvanidhi. It wasn't colored in. It's just in line drawings. I think there is some shading in there in black and white, but it was from a text that they happened to find in a pandit's house, and he passed it on to there. It was passed on to the Oriental Institute when he died, and there were 2 copies in the palace. One was the Queen's copy, and the other one, and one of them disappeared. One of the copies disappeared, but there was still one copy kept in the Saraswati Bandar library in the palace, and Srikantadatta allowed me to photograph it.
Did you manage to find any? I mean, you mentioned the Yoga Kurunta as extant. I mean, did you manage to find any traces of anything, more clearly delineating the Ashtanga sequences?
Not really. The Ashtanga sequence is kind of um, the ideas are there in the Sritattvanidhi, but they aren't explicitly brought out. They're thinking of that more as a sort of text on individual asanas rather than the movement and those kind of things.
Yeah. When you were doing this study and you were there and you must have been talking to people, I mean, did you learn more about the background of Krishnacharya? I mean, because it's always mentioned he goes off to Tibet for all these years and he finds the Yoga Kurunta there, but always given the Yoga Kurunta by his teacher there. I mean, did what surprised you about this your time studying in the Mysore Palace?
Well, what surprised me about what I found in the Mysore Palace?
Yeah. All your time talking to, I mean, you must have talked to librarians and different people there. Right?
Yeah. Actually, it's the situation of yoga at that time was there was no interest in yoga. There was no popular interest in yoga. And amongst the pandits and the scholars, there was no real interest in yoga. The idea was that Vedanta was really the outcome of yoga, and Vedanta was looked upon as being the purpose of yoga, which no longer had a validity. And part of the thing was it was a dualistic philosophy, and the dualism didn't hold up philosophically. You couldn't make the connection between Purusha and Prakriti satisfactorily philosophically. So it wasn't looked on the popularization of yoga as the popularization of Sanskrit really has come from Western interest.
I mean, yeah, it's hard to fathom at that time. There really wasn't anyone else doing modern scholarship on origins. They, just kind of translating old texts, right? So you were really out on the limb at that point, and you got some, as we mentioned, you got quite a lot of heavy criticism for it, didn't you? I mean, were you surprised?
Well, no, I knew it was going to be a bombshell,
right?
But I got physical threats. People would say, "Well, I'm going to write a book on that, and I'm going to tell the truth." And but I think I was covered quite well. That it was very hard evidence to argue against.
What do you think upset people about the book? If people haven't read, the book or seen this book, I mean, what was it that was particularly kind of like a kind of shattering or kind of about this book? Let's say
I'm not really sure in total, but I've been told I've insulted the Ashtanga teachers, that it was an insult to them, and I think one of the big problems is this Western ideas of the guru. Like they want to put this divine thing on the guru, that this is a divine knowledge, and the Ashtangis felt that they were getting the correct knowledge from the guru from 3,000 years ago, and that book kind of blew that away.
And go back to the Yoga Kurunta again. I mean, it means other people have more recently, I think, like Jason, have said that a number of people actually have mentioned the connection to Kurunta as rope or something like that, right? Have you heard of that idea that there is a book out there called the Yoga Kurunta, but it's a rope postures?
The Lonavala Yoga Institute published what was the Yoga Kurunta. They had published it under a different name because they didn't know it was a hatha abhyasa paddhati. And after Jason's research, I think that's come up, and they assume I think Jason assumes that it's a Maharashtrian manuscript.
Right. and the Hatha Abhyasa Paravrti, this is a similar text to the Tatvanidhi, right? It's based on this text.
It has 120 some asanas in it, and it's got a big section on sex in there too, on I don't know what it's called. What connected with Vajroli Mudra.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And where is that text, and where did it come from?
Well, that text is one that the Lonavala Institute had in their manuscript collection, and the text that is in the Mysore Palace is actually indicated with numbers that show the correspondence to the Sritattvanidhi. So it was a source book for the Sritattvanidhi asanas. And there is another book on asanas also. The Jodhpur Institute has a text, a number of texts with a number of asanas also. And I don't know whether you know that story of the Nath Yogins in Jodhpur.
No. I'd love to hear.
Well, there was a king called Man Singh, and he invited the Nath Yogins into Jodhpur, and they came there, and of course they began to cause problems, playing so-called magic tricks on people and sexual things apparently. And eventually the citizens of Jodhpur told him either he had to go or the yogis had to go. And he abdicated from the throne and went with the yogis. But what it's left a whole collection of texts on yoga in the Jodhpur Palace.
You didn't get inspired after writing that book to go further into this and right.
Actually, I applied for a Canada Council grant to travel around because I wanted to go around to small places where there were yoga centers and things like that and check for other texts. We had a jeep and 9 languages between us, and they didn't give a grant.
Right. Maybe protectionist within this dissemination of more recent roots of yoga. Perhaps there's a reticence to own that by.
Yeah, at that time it was I don't know about grants. I've always had a problem with trying to get grants to do things. When I've written big save the world type applications that are totally useless, they give the money. If you know what you're doing, they don't want to give it.
How the Yoga Makarunda that actually Darby showed me, is that how is that similar to the Tatvanidhi, or can you see some direct correlation through? I mean, how close, for those people that want to know, how close Krishnamacharya's yoga that he taught as Ashtanga yoga is to these texts? Is it one of the same thing, or do we see some influences from these earlier texts, but him kind of making his own interpretations as well?
Well, they must have had. I would assume that they had connection. I believe that Krishnamacharya lists the Sritattvanidhi in his bibliography, but he doesn't list the Yoga Karunta in his text that he did. And I can't remember. It's so long since I've looked at Pattabhi Jois's work. It's so long since I've looked at my own work that it's hard for me to compare it or to say anything about it that's off the wall.
Yeah. You sent me your Yoga Sutras, which is a really interesting read. What is specific about your take on the Yoga Sutras? Because it was unusual.
Well, I think that basically what I sort of came to was what yoga is about is the exploration of consciousness. And the exploration of consciousness is done by working with 3 things: knowledge, action, and desire. And the whole structure of the Yoga Sutras is based on that. The first pada is knowledge. The second one is Kriya Yoga, or actions. And the third is the desire, or the vibhutis, and the vibhutis and the samadhis, the ultimate samadhis. So I hadn't come to that conclusion. I mean, I came to that conclusion as I worked with the Yoga Sutras. And then when you see it in that fashion, that as an exploration of consciousness, you realize that what they've been talking about in the Upanishads and the earlier texts and the texts from 1,000 years later is the same thing. They've worked with the same with that problem, so they have a continuity of scholarship from 1,500, 2,000 years before the Yoga Sutras, and for the next 1,500 or 2,000 years afterwards, where there is that exploration. And now this becomes more relevant because we have Western philosophers like Donald Hoffman and others who are speaking about these kinds of things, whereas previously people who explored those kinds of things were burned as witches, and such things are put off to the side as being crazies. So no, I wouldn't have come to those conclusions except through looking closely at the Yoga Sutras.
And this is a work that you are going to be publishing soon. Is that right?
Well, maybe it's. I've never had. One of the reasons why I haven't published is because even when I do publish, I lose control over it, and I don't get paid.
Right. Problems. Are you still practicing yoga? What does yoga mean for you these days? Are you chanting shastra or practicing asana?
Well, I'm reading the Mahabharata and the Spandakadikas over and over again with different commentaries. So I still continue on, and I can't do asanas any longer because I cracked my tibia. I was walking in the forest one day and I slipped on the ice. I slid down a mountainside and hit a tree, and my leg bent backward and cracked the tibia.
Oh, God.
So I'm waiting for some possibility of replacement on that. So that's kind of hindered my movement. And in fact, I haven't gone anywhere for the last 3 years because of that as well.
I was going to say, are you going back to India at all these days? When was the last time you were there?
It was probably about 5 or 6 years ago. I took a young yoga student. He needed an operation on his arm, and we went to India and did it.
And are you teaching at the University of Calgary now?
I teach advanced asanas in my house.
So you've always been teaching yoga as well, as a postural yoga?
Almost 46 years I've been throwing bodies.
I didn't know that. Right. And I mean, just slightly tangential now, going back to the book again. How do you see that the whole thing has evolved from your book? Are you pleased with the direction it's going? I mean, because so much has come out of that subsequently. Do you want to comment on, it's your chance to comment on how you see modern yoga scholarship progressing now and the direction it's going now? What do you think about that?
Well, I think the most serious work has been done by scholars today like James Mallinson and Jason Birch and Mark, and also the book by a very interesting book by Elliot Goldberg, Pathways of Modern Yoga.
That was good. Yeah.
And then on the other hand, there's a series of scholars which haven't been necessarily connected with yoga. Sanderson, Mark Dixkowski, and Philip Maas. These people have done very interesting work. It hasn't really been taken up by the yoga people. But there's work that has superseded is some of the most interesting work on philosophy and Sanskrit that has come out.
What is it in particular that you see is being drawn out now that wasn't there before? Subsequent, I mean, really, it was a watershed time. This book of yours, and and how has that changed things?
Again, I didn't quite get that.
How do you think the direction of yoga has now changed subsequent to your book and with the work of Jim and James and Jason Birch?
Well, the capitalist machine seems to be the main influence on yoga today. Like that's what's driving it in some kind of a way. But people are doing better asanas. They're examining their asanas more closely amongst all the other paraphernalia, like their yoga mats and things.
Did seeing those these asanas that you managed to photograph, did that change your perspective on physical yoga practice and the way that you practiced and taught?
Well, I worked in a kind of a different way. Since I worked with individual teachers, it was always hands-on. And working hands-on, like I consider manipulations to be openings that you open into part of them that belongs to them. It's their natural self. So that you can go along with somebody, and just by touching them or moving them in some kind of a way, you can take them through postural preferences and into what is their own self in an instant. Whereas they might never get that if they're working through their own limitations, kind of thing. So basically, that's the way that I like to work.
I suppose I didn't ask you originally. What do you think the purpose of these? Hatha yoga. The book, which is the book that's inspired the Tattvanidhi, the Abhyasa Paravritti or something like that. I mean, do you see these books as teaching modern yoga for the purpose of physical exploration? Or, I mean, you mentioned before that the asana was an interpolation, a kind of an anomaly.
Well, if you look at the definitions in Patanjali, Sthira-Sukhamasanam, Prayatna Shaitilyanda Samapatibhyam, I mean, you can take those definitions, and they include everything in those definitions. Prayatna, effort; Prayatna Shaitilya, slackening of the effort, finding balance; Ananta Samapatibhyam, and an element of transcendence. Ananta Samapatibhyam in the asana, where it becomes complete. So even in Patanjali, by that simple definition of 4 words, he's covered the whole possibility of asanas. And actually, in Patanjali, I mean, one can say that asanas don't belong, but that second pada is Kriya Yoga, the yoga of action. And action includes everything. This is a means to work through your postural preferences, is to come to a realization of your own self. So it's also an examination, a reflection on consciousness through your first world, which is your body.
Yeah. Well,
in fact, in my second book, I've divided asanas, rather than putting them into groups. I've divided them simply into moving asanas and still static asanas.
Yeah, because in the original text that you photographed, I mean, there's no mention of the vinyasa, is there, at all? I mean, we haven't brought up that point.
There's no mention of it, but there are asanas that are part of the vinyasa series.
Right. So is there a precedent for this, the jumping movement that Krishnamacharya is famed for in these?
Well, I think Jason Birch, he had the theory that many of these asanas that are in the Sritattvanidhi or in the other are parts of a continuation of a moving asana. And it's more clear in the hatha abhyasa paddhati than it is in the Sritattvanidhi, because they've been separated in a different way in the Sritattvanidhi. They're a different sequence.
Right. And before that, is there any recognizable trace of the Tattvanidhi, the Abhyasa, to something before that? Do you know yet?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I could only speak generally. The Pahalwans, or the wrestlers, they do have a series of moves that they do on poles, on ropes, and things like that, all of which are somehow related to yoga. And I just got sent a manuscript from India of 37 pictures of which looks sort of like yoga, but what it really looks like is it's some of the things that street performers do, standing on a pole in the air in Padmasana and things like that. That there's somehow a yoga relation, but not directly. So these things are in the sort of, no, we don't see those anymore in India. They used to be there, but you don't see them any longer. So there is a general connection in some kind of a way, but and people adapt. I mean, this is one of the problems that I talked about in the very beginning of the yoga tradition of the Mysore Palace, is that people think tradition is a static thing. And it's not. Tradition adapts. It looks at things and it accumulates, throws out, forgets, adds in. I mean, for it to become vital again. And in fact, that's what Krishnamacharya and Iyengar did. They revitalized the tradition again. They made it into something meaningful.
Finally, do you know anything about Ayer? I think you mentioned Eliot's book, but he talks about the bodybuilding kind of gym a couple of doors down from Krishnamacharya's Yogasana. I mean, do you know anything about the influence of Ayer on Krishnamacharya?
Well, there was a book that I got a hold of that's in Canada, the Vyayama Deepika, which literally means the light on exercise. And I can't remember the exact, but it's got, I think, 21 different categories of exercises. Swimming, the equivalent of barbells, parallel bars. And a lot of these were set up by the English for the royal family, as they wanted to train them and have them under their thumb in a way. And in fact, there was I think his name was Bharadwaj, I'm not quite sure, who was hired as a sort of a personal trainer for Nalavadi Krishnaraja Wadiyar, who was the crown prince, because Mumadi, who wrote the Sritattvanidhi, who was done under him, as he became older, he became less manipulable. And that gym was where Krishnamacharya took over, and it had ropes, parallel bars, all sorts of things like that in there, in that gym. That was in the Jagan Mohan Palace originally.
Yeah. So that was a different room to this kind of gym of Iyer that was also patronized by the Maharaj.
I think that what the Maharaja did is he wanted to have an exercise system that had some kind of indigenous quality to it. So Krishnamacharya was put on the palace payroll and given that gym area to work with the Arasu boys, who were the sons of the royal family. So that's how that started off. And then afterwards, he ended up in the Mahapathasala, which was also patronized by the royal family, but open to a whole other group of people.
What do you see the direction of yoga in India, modern India today is? related to this perhaps reluctance to accept that tradition is continuously evolving, right? and looking for more ancient roots in it, to claim it as something particularly indigenous to India. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, there has been a whole movement of both in India and primarily in America to take yoga back. And that's basically a politicization of yoga as being a Hindu contribution to the world. And so there's been that movement. And of course, with Modi, that has become even more. But this is they're strong.
Mm. Mm. Okay, Norman, it's been an amazing interview. What are you doing now? Where are you going? What are you studying nowadays? What's on the agenda next?
Well, what am I studying nowadays? I'm trying to read the Sagara, which is a 12-volume work, which is very easy Sanskrit, and I'm reading the Shanti Parvan of the Mahabharata in Sanskrit.
Oh,
I read the whole Mahabharata when I was in India. It took me 3 years at 5 chapters a day.
In Sanskrit?
I had Sanskrit and English. Because I didn't want to look up all the words individually at the time, so I had both, so I could look it up quickly.
Oh, it's just incredible. I mean, if someone wants to kind of start in this field of understanding Sanskrit or any other kind of scholarship, do you have any advice for them?
Well, I'm very happy about the way that I studied Sanskrit, that I went there and worked with teachers. That wouldn't be possible today. You could do it, but it'd be very difficult to do in the same way. So I was happy with that, but it hasn't done me. I haven't been able to contribute as much as I would have liked to have done with that knowledge. And it's very difficult fitting into the universities because a class of an hour or 3 hours a week isn't enough to be able to work with a language. In fact, even languages in general, I feel like it takes 5 years of communication to be able to understand a language. And I was lucky when I went to Mysore. I couldn't speak Kannada, and the pandits who I was learning from couldn't speak English. So all my teaching was in Sanskrit. So that made a big difference. The modern world has problems.
Maybe we'll leave it there. What a great ending. Well, it's been just a historic moment to connect with you, and I'm sure that the audience will really appreciate hearing some of this. What was such a formative point in the yoga study that we're now kind of witnessing by people that we've mentioned, modern yoga scholars. So I want to thank you again for your contribution, Norman, and thanks for coming on and speaking to me. So enjoyable time with you.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you.